And I've heard from the team that we are live on YouTube as well as in the Zoom webinar, so we'll get going. Welcome back to London Conference 2020, Day 3. I'm Kate Speliopolis, and I'm Head of Events at Centre for London. As a reminder, if you're going to be tweeting about this or anything else you've seen at London Conference, use the hashtag LonConf20, that's LONCONF 20, to follow the discussion online. If you're in the Zoom webinar with us this evening, you can use the Q&A function to ask the panelists any questions that you might have, and you can upvote other questions that you think are particularly good. So that should be just at the bottom menu on the right-hand side. And you can make well use of the chat function as well. We've had some great debates so far at London Conference in there. So we've done almost 10 years worth of London conferences now, and I think this is the first one that we've ever done where the housing crisis has taken a backseat to everything else that's going on in the world in London right now. But you know what, we just can't resist. And in fact, I think this is a pressing problem that is not going away, even though there are so many other things going on in London this year. It's yet to be addressed. And our new ways of living, working, and moving around the city are becoming increasingly complicated. They're challenging current models and orthodoxies. And although nobody knows how long our current situation is going to last, it's definitely making people think differently about what the future of homes in London should be. So that's what we're going to talk about this evening. And now I'm going to pass on to our chair for this session, Olivia Harris. She's also the chair of the Westminster Property Association and the chief executive of Dolphin Living. So Olivia, welcome to the London Conference stage.
Thank you so much, Kate. As Kate said, I work for a housing charity, Dolphin Living, which provides homes to London's workers at rents they can afford. We've got 800 homes in zones 1 to 3, 83% of which are affordable, and our average rent is 59% of the local market rent. So to join me today and to discuss the homes that London's needs, Centre for London have brought together a panel who work in different aspects of housing to share their experiences and their points of view. So please could the panel introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about the work they do. So if we can first hear from Caitlin, then Fiona, then Indy.
Hi, thanks everyone for inviting me to speak at the Centre for London Conference. My name is Caitlin Wilkinson. I'm the policy manager at Generation Rent. Generation Rent is a national campaigning organisation, and we work to ensure that privately rented homes are safe, are secure, and are affordable.
Thank you. Fiona?
Hello everybody, I am Fiona Fletcher-Smith and I'm Group Director of Development and Sales at L&Q. We are one of the largest housing associations in the country and one of the biggest developers in the country. So we have a development programme of about 5.1 billion nationally, representing almost 100,000 homes either on site or land we already own. But more importantly for us, we are a registered and regulated housing charity, and we are also the landlord to just over 250,000 people, and that is one of the main reasons we exist, and that sense of social purpose about looking after the existing homes as well as building new homes for people who need them. That's me.
Thanks, Fiona. Indy?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Indy Johar from Dark Matter Labs. We're an agency that works from Seoul to Montreal, looking at systems change largely and looking at the complex transitions our cities are facing in many of those issues. And I'll pick them up later. Thank you.
Thank you. So, as Kate said, it's widely reported that London has a housing crisis. But what does this actually mean? What did it mean before COVID, and how have things changed during the pandemic? So house prices in London are 13 times median gross annual earnings, meaning buying a home is out of the reach of many workers. In most, if not all London boroughs, market rents are above London living rents, which are championed by the mayor and as affordable to the median earner. So if median earners can't afford to buy or rent, what happens? They compromise on housing needs or pay housing costs that mean they have insufficient income to meet the rest of their living costs. And the pandemic has highlighted how we as a society rely on certain workers. these critical workers go beyond the traditional definition of key workers, yet many of them earn modest incomes and could be described as median or low earners. So whilst they contribute significantly and support society, the housing needs of many of these critical workers are not met by the housing market. These are the workers that Dolphin Living seeks to provide homes for, and as I stated earlier, we offer them at rents with a discount to market rent. So many of those who cannot access affordable housing, such as that offered by Dolphin or L&Q, will be housed in the private rental sector. And here it seems right for me to bring Caitlin in. Caitlin, we all assume that it's people in their 20s and 30s who rent, but it's no longer just those. So why do people rent?
Thanks, Olivia. I mean, the first reason that people would rent is, because some people do want to. I think we should set out that renting offers, flexibility for thousands of Londoners, for people who want to live near work, people who are students, people who want to live near leisure facilities. But you're right. I mean, and given the size of the PRS in London, it's currently 2.2 million renters, and that's grown significantly in the last few years. It's clear not everyone is renting through choice. As you stated, a vast number of Londoners just can't afford to buy. The average age of the first-time buyer is now 34, which is 6 years older than the average age of 28. In London, that's much higher. And in London, an average deposit can be from around 80 to 100k, which is unaffordable for the vast majority of workers in the city. And as a result, young people, many are giving up on the idea of buying their own home and are renting for longer. The fastest growing group of renters, one of the fastest group of renters nationally is people in their 40s and above, and 1 in 5 families now live in the private rented sector as well. So it's not, it's no longer a generation rent type of thing. London's private rented sector is incredibly diverse. Another reason people rent is because they're at the bottom of the list for social housing. I had a look at the MHCLG figures for London just before coming on here, and it's 243,000 households are waiting for social housing in the capital. And in Newham, there's 27,000 households on the housing waiting list, which is the highest in London. And there's also in the last 5 years, the number of households living in temporary accommodation has increased by almost 1/3 in London. So people are, by and large, in the private rented sector. Obviously, some people are choosing to do it. It suits them, but there's a lot of people now who just can't live anywhere else.
Yeah, it's the same in Westminster where Dolphin Living operate. The wait to get a permanent social home through the council is often more than 10 years. And we just want to expand on what you said about what has the impact of the pandemic been on renters, what they want and what they can afford.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And I've noticed recently there's been lots of headlines about dramatic decreases in London rents. There was some really widely covered research that shows that rents in central London have been reduced by up to 1/3, which at first glance surely can only be a good thing for renters. But actually, the picture is a lot more complicated than that. So while rents in areas like Westminster, as I'm sure you know, but also places like Aldgate, Maida Vale, they are plummeting because basically all of the relatively higher earners and young professionals who've moved to home working are basically reassessing, and lots of them are leaving, moving further away from the centre of London or moving out altogether. But in the suburbs, rents are staying pretty constant and are even going up in areas like Thamesmead or Chingford. And also what we're also seeing for many of the people who don't have the opportunity to just up and leave when a pandemic hits, there's increased reliance on universal credit. Generation Rent analysed the figures last week and found that the number of private renters in London claiming universal credit doubled in the first 3 months of the pandemic. So 40% of Londoners now rely on it. And as I'm sure many of us in this seminar know, universal credit is set at the housing element of universal credit is set at the lower 1/3 of rents. So as a result, there's far more people behind on their rent and facing a massive shortfall. So it's really kind of a tale of two sets broadly of private renters. Some are just upping and leaving, but many people are staying in London and running up huge debts as a result.
So you mentioned rents in Westminster have gone down by 1/3, but if we look at what is affordable, the discount needs to be greater than that. And I mentioned that our average discount is something over 40%. So Fiona, that brings me on to you. Caitlin talked about, the exodus from London, and that seems to be an exodus possibly from the centre to the suburbs. So do you think that London still needs the amount of homes that we've been recently hearing we need to deliver to make up the shortfall?
Well, I think if we go back to something else that Caitlin said about 243,000 people in housing need in London, I think absolutely we do. We need somewhere between the London plan figures of 65 and 100,000 new homes a year. And the reason I say that is the assessment is generally that about 50% of those homes need to be affordable. Now, we can have a long debate about the nature of affordability and what affordable rent actually means. But if you take the example of the average L&Q resident, they have an income of £13,000 per year. So actually there's quite a need for homes that people can actually afford to pay the rent. And the idea that home ownership is going to answer all of our dreams and aspirations is not necessarily the case. People may not want to, but simply lenders may not lend to somebody on an income of £13,000 per year. So I absolutely do believe we need that level of new building in London, simply to catch up with the backlog of people that we need to house. Now, going forward, I think it's too early to say what the legacy of the pandemic will be. Something else Caitlin was talking about was the drop in rents in central London in the PRS, the private rented sector. A lot of that is about second homes. It's about people who are now working from home in their country home because it's easier to do that. And therefore, reletting those homes is not a simple process. But I have to say, in developments that I'm building, like Barking Riverside, I am seeing no decrease in demand whatsoever. I am seeing at least 100 people chasing every single home that we're building out there. And that is saying to me that it isn't a simple thing. I think if you are well enough off to be able to have your country home, good for you, that's brilliant. But we need a diversity of people in London. We need the key workers that we have relied on so desperately over the last 12 months.
Yeah, and again, Fiona, I agree with you on that. And I think it's broader than key workers. Key workers are traditionally defined as public sector workers, but actually a lot of the people that we've relied on over the last 8 months are not necessarily in the public sector. They're people that support the infrastructure of the city that we live in. And we've been doing a lot of work on redefining key workers. But you said that we need more homes. And one of the things that taxes you, and I know taxes me, is how are these funded? Because in the absence of significant amounts of grant, you at L&Q have relied on cross subsidy from market homes, but there is a lot of uncertainty in market sale, particularly when the current stamp duty holiday goes. And what other things might prevent you from putting the maximum amount of resources into delivering new homes?
I mean, that's a great question to ask, Olivia. I think I'm getting used to uncertainty, because just as we were getting over the uncertainty of the political situation and we had a government with a majority of 80 MPs, the pandemic hit. So we're used to it. But what we want to do at L&Q is we build for outright sale so that we can use that subsidy then to build the affordable social housing that is what we're about as a housing association, essentially. But there are two reasons for that being really difficult at the moment. The first one is that market uncertainty. We are seeing a lot of demand at the moment, but that is falsely inflated potentially by stamp duty and the coming to an end of Help to Buy early next year. But the other thing for us is a big landlord. I said earlier, we're the landlord of about 250,000 people. And the first thing in my mind is the safety of our existing homes. The decency of our existing homes, and coming over the horizon, whether they will be meeting the environmental standards that the climate emergency is absolutely telling us we need to do. But in a post-Grenfell world, I want to make sure that any of the towers and high-rise and the homes that we've already built, that people feel safe in them and that they are safe. And that will be the first call on any subsidy or profit that we make, and that therefore reduces the pool of money available for new homes.
Absolutely. So I just want to move on a bit, because we've heard from the renters and we've heard from the housing providers, But what about something more radical to respond to the points made and deliver the housing that London needs? So Indy, I'm intrigued by the scientific approach taken by Dark Matter Labs, which you co-founded. And scientists aren't normally thought of as creative because they follow established theories. However, we all know that actually creative scientists are those that use their creativity to challenge the establishment and so make new discoveries. Please share with us how your labs use this approach to challenge the established housing policies, delivery or market, and what in particular do you think will be the new discovery in a post-pandemic city like London?
Thank you, Olivia. I mean, I'll sort of share what are kind of our initial reflections. I think my slight worry is a lot of our conversations are focused on what London was and making sure London is okay in the vision of 2004, 2008. And everywhere I go, the vision of the city that's been indoctrinated is what I would call as an urban renaissance thesis of London, which is, you have a central business district bustling away, and then you have some suburbia, but you've got to get rid of it. It's a bit of a messy and horrible thing because we really like urban density, and we think urban density is a solution. And it's so deeply indoctrinated in our thesis of urbanism, I think we've lost critical insight into actually what the future city most likely is now triggering us into. So in a lot of the conversations I get into, everyone kind of keeps going, the urban centre. Well, there's a good chance the urban centre of London doesn't come back. And if you look at actually what's happened to the kind of economic geography of London, it's massively been transformed. And if we are in lockdown for, say, another 4 to 5, 6 months, I think there are, certainly an organization like DM, which was largely UK-based pre-Brexit, which is now a global network of 40 people going from Seoul to Montreal, we've completely shifted our organizational pattern. We've had people leave London quite comfortably, move to Wales. We've had people leave London, move to South Korea, but still persist in the organization that we've got. So I worry that, firstly, I don't think our analysis is solid. And I think we've got a lot of indoctrination, which is kind of carrying on going through the system. So that's step one. Step two is I think the house is being reframed. So all of our housing standards are really based on a very old-fashioned idea of everyone goes out to work and you're living in your house about 40 minutes a day before you go to sleep. And actually the reality is the house has now become the site of consumption and the site of work. So our retail space is actually in the house and our workspace is in the house. I don't think our housing standards are anywhere near fit for purpose to this new society and new economy that's emerging. And so let's take that as kind of one point. And again, this is not going to be universal, but certainly for London, which is a services city, which is massive amounts of professional services, lots of digitized work, which is actually being transformed. I don't think our housing standards are anywhere near up for this sort of conversation. And I think we need radical transformation of what is a house for Londoners and what is a house in that thesis. Second is, I think we need to, and this goes back to Caitlin's point, I think that we need to understand that our housing economy has become an economic rent-seeking infrastructure. And we have to much more structurally understand our housing economy has become that because we were operating in an intangibles economy. In an intangibles economy, land became the mechanism to rent seek. So I think we need a much more fundamental transformation of our relationship of what is the value of a house. So if I was to take a house and move it into, take a London house, probably worth about 800 to 700,000, pick that up, move it to middle of Nova Scotia. How much is the house worth? Next to nothing. The predominant value of the house comes from its access value, not its utility value, its access value to public goods, labor markets and other things. And that access value is being transformed. So I think we need a much more substantive look at what is the value of the house. Third dimension is understanding the house as a function of our value with its street and its neighborhood. We know an outstanding school puts £100,000 on a price of up to £100,000 on a price of a local house. We know tree-lined streets put £7,000 to £8,000 on the price of a local house. A house's value comes as a function of its street. And if we're looking at the transformation of our housing infrastructure, which is, I think, another part of the conversation we really need to have, is the deep retrofit of our housing infrastructure across London, which is, I think, where we're going to have to go to be able to actually deal with some of the strategic economic crisis that we're going to go to. So deep retrofit of all of London's housing stock, that's going to require us to reimagine not the house, but the street. And we have to talk about it from a street level retrofit thesis rather than individual housing level retrofit thesis. And the final point I'd make is that often when we're talking about regearing London, we talk about it from the perspective of looking at the high street and the house. The high street's irrelevant, right? Stop talking about the high street. I think we should be talking about the village common. London is going from an inner and outer London thesis to a city of villages. That's the transition we're in the middle of. No longer an inner London and outer London, but a city of villages. Second is, I think what we need to put the center of communities is the village common or natural assets rather than new locations for consumption. I think that's fundamentally transformed. And we need to have a much more radical view of what future needs to look like if London is going to be the 21st century location for talent, creativity, craft, innovation that we're going to need it to be in a radical format. And that requires a foundational shift in the environmental justice provided by housing stock and our places. Light pollution, air pollution, sound pollution, these things are going to have to be transformed for us to build the London that's necessary. And that revolution doesn't start in central London. That revolution starts in the suburbs, transforming all of London deeply.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really interesting. A lot of the building that we see in the suburbs, though, Indy, is this dense housing that that's traditionally been delivered in central London. Is that the right approach?
No, I mean, I would say what we should be talking about is kind of we did a piece of work looking at how you could transform. So firstly, we're doing a piece of work around deep retrofits for whole streets. We're doing that in Edinburgh and various cities across Europe. The other part is what we should be thinking about is repurposing or taking a single unit plot and making a multi-unit plot, but not. And I think we should be talking about the privilege of outdoor space. Private outdoor space has a high premium. We have to talk about shared outdoor space have a high premium. I think it's about the deep densification of London, but not in the kind of classic flat sense. I don't think that's where we're headed. And we have to start to think about what creates the environment, the living environment, the living case for us to compete with global cities for the 21st century economy. And I still think we're trying to fix the retail economy of the last century. I think we have to think much more boldly. Sorry, I'm going to shut up. So, yeah, but that's it.
No, that's really interesting. Now, Fiona, I can see you clapping. And I can see you want to respond to what Indy's saying. So, what would you add to that in terms of you being the person that's, as development director, that's going to be delivering these homes and also designing them?
Well, it's one of the problems with a virtual online conference, isn't it? You can't hear the clapping. Because Indy, that's fantastic. An enormous set of challenges there for us. And so many of them spot on. The thing I was clapping about is this reimagining of London, which isn't just about the central activity zone all the time. We hear people bleating about London dying. Well, I can assure you, in my little village of South London, my little town centre in South London, it is absolutely booming because nobody is getting on that train every morning and heading into the centre and coming back every evening, doing that 40 minutes and then zonking. Since lockdown, my little village has had a brand new butcher, brand new baker, 2 new coffee shops, and there are queues, socially distanced queues, outside them, and it feels like a different place. It feels far more alive than it ever has to me on the occasions when I did work from home pre-lockdown, and that is to be celebrated. If you look back at the Irish London Fund, where the City Hall were trying to reactivate and re-energise our high streets, a lot of money got spent, a lot of projects were delivered, but really it didn't make that structural change that we needed to how London operates. And, I know TfL's on its knees and this is terrible, but the idea of us all not trekking in and out of London every day, it's got to be a good thing, surely. So, yeah, I'm just clapping. I'm clapping for the challenge. I'm loving it, Indy.
And thank you. So just for now, I think I'm going to just move on. There's a few questions that have come up that have been asked by the audience. I think this first one is probably for you, Caitlin. Do you think the private rented sector needs better regulation And if so, what would you advocate? And then I'll ask the other panelists if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, in short, absolutely, the private rented sector needs better regulation. I kind of don't quite know where to start, but so one of the biggest problems with the PRS is that it's got a higher number of unsafe homes than any other tenure. I think in London, as many London boroughs will tell you, there's a massive problem with houses of multiple occupancy, many of which aren't even registered, don't meet basic safety or standard qualities. And I think the prevalence of houses of multiple occupancy, which is in normal language just shared houses, where you've got maybe like 5 tenancies in what would have been one large house, like really does show how the value of a home in London used to be so attached to being, near an office, and people would live in shared accommodation for far later, and it now is completely illogical in the pandemic to be sitting in a bedroom all day with 5 other housemates. But on standards, because I've slightly gone on a rant, I think we do need to first have oversight of who's in the sector. One of the reasons why the private rented sector is so poorly regulated is because there's so many landlords in it. It's not like lots of landlords are just individuals, or they have 1 or 2 properties, and while they are businesses, lots of individuals don't see themselves that way. And as a result, it's very disparate, very difficult to keep track of who is letting out decent homes and who isn't. And also, especially in London, I mean, local authority teams tell us that the size of the private rented sector's doubled in the last 20 years, and their budgets and their enforcement teams just haven't. So lots of local authorities, and this is not for a second to point the finger of blame, but some people don't even know how many landlords are in their borough because of a lack of funding. And so I think the first thing that needs to happen is a register of landlords. It's actually the only area, England is the only part of the UK where there's not even a register of who's in the sector. So I think before you come into any sort of conversations about how to regulate it, you need to start with that information. And once you have that information, you can be much more ambitious than just kind of regulating landlords and making sure that they are providing decent homes. You can collect really, really useful data on everything from how many people are in the sector, how long they've been there, what the rents are at a really granular level, where people move, and use that data to make better decisions. So in a word, yes. And the first step to any regulation is better understanding who's in the sector.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Fiona, Indy, do you want to come in on that sort of? I know, Fiona, you are regulated. Dolphin Living are partly regulated. So
yeah. So I would say Caitlin's absolutely right. There's a lot of rubbish accommodation out there, and people are living in some dreadful conditions. But at the other end of the scale, there's some fantastic private rented providers. People like Granger come to mind, for example, superb organisation. What I would say about regulation is we need to make our mind up what we are doing and get on with it, because what I'm always concerned about is that people like ourselves, the Grangers, the Grey Stars, the big institutional backed investors in the sector, maybe certainty. So
is it just me, or have we lost Fiona for a minute?
I couldn't hear either.
Sorry, Fiona, we missed the end of that.
Am I back?
Yeah.
No, I've got a 10-year-old in another room on Minecraft, which could be doing it for me. I mean, this is the other thing. We really do need to sort out the broadband capacity of this city.
Absolutely.
No, so I was just saying, if we are going to regulate, make our minds up what the regulation is and get on with it.
And I suppose the other thing, and I'd like your input probably, and Indy's on this, is we've had some changes in planning regulation proposed over the course of the pandemic and in response to the pandemic. Do we think this is going to help us deliver the homes that London needs? I would suggest that the raising of the limit of the number of homes in a development that needs to contribute to affordable housing is a backward step. But I'd be really interested to hear both of your opinions on that. And Indy, probably you're going to tell me it just doesn't go far enough. But what is your response to what's happened?
Well, I mean, I'll let other people come in on some of that. I mean, one thing I wanted to add was that I think when we're talking about regulation, we just have to understand that land and assets have, I think it's about 68% of our national wealth is locked into land, something ridiculous. We have foundationally the misallocation of our investment as a nation is focused on buildings. It is a strategic problem that we are misallocating capital into rent-seeking infrastructure, which is property and land. Property is not a house is not a productive asset. And yet we're pouring more and more of the nation's wealth and redirecting it into that story. And I think there is a strategic problem here that we, at a macroeconomic level, need to wean ourselves off unproductive assets as the mechanism of growing the GDP of the UK. And until we do that, and that's not just a financial incentives problem. It's then effectively, where is that capital being allocated? How do you induce that capital to be allocated into new pathways? So there is a macroeconomic problem that the middle classes have been left pretty much with no other investment class other than the house as the mechanism of having some residual value into society. And I think that's a strategic issue for the UK, because I think it's destroying our productive capacity and creating a rent-seeking economy simultaneously. And I think, we need to have a much more honest conversation about that story and have an honest conversation about how we wean ourselves off that macroeconomic framing and stop thinking supply and demand of housing is going to solve this problem. Because I get infinitely bored by people saying, oh, we'll build 200,000 more homes, we'll solve the problem. It isn't that problem. That is not the problem. The problem is, at a macroeconomic level, our wealth is created in a very particular way. And that is a problem for us long term, especially now with Brexit, where we aren't basically a global store of capital, where we're going to have to shift from being a global store of capital to becoming a productive source of capital. That's a strategic allocation issue. And I think London needs to understand that and repurpose itself. And in that thesis, property is not your asset. Property is a utility for functional use. And I think we've impaired the functional utility of London through our property economy. And I think we need to have a much more serious conversation at that level. So I just put that there.
That's contrary to sort of the national psyche that the Englishman's castle is his home. Sorry, I'm going to go a bit off topic here, but which other you said that your colleagues work in 40 different locations. Where does it better than London? Where delivers the housing that people need by having a different model?
Montreal. It's a really good example. Montreal is one of the few cities in the world which actually didn't fall capture to basically a thesis that if you raise rents or raised land value, you would drive innovation. That was kind of an underlying thesis. You could keep lifting rents and that would drive kind of displacement into it. Look at Montreal's economy, and that was largely a function of kind of what happened with Quebec and French-speaking infrastructures and what they did, but the land value didn't go up. And so what you see is a completely different quality of life, completely different deep innovation capacity. So you see quite a different outcomes. And there are other parts as well. I just use that example because it comes to the top of my head, but it's a fundamental different innovation economy. So its innovation is cultural, it's got AI infrastructure, it's got much more hybrid innovation capacity, which is supporting a high quality lifestyle in a deeper way. So I think we just can look for other innovation systems which aren't based on land value inflation as our only thesis. And we just need to have a collective conversation about that as a society and become much more cognizant. And it's not saying the Englishman's or Englishwoman's home is not their castle. It is. It's just saying it isn't a rent-seeking mechanism to basically steal from one generation to the other in perpetuity, because it won't work. We're seeing the concentration of wealth, which will become problematic. I'm sorry, I think there's lots of hands up as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to the questions that are being asked. And we've got one here from Camilla Anderson. There's an obvious difference here between people who can and people who can't work from home. And is there a scope for regulating housing access in accordance with people's need or their right to ask to also access their work either physically or digitally? I'm thinking of key workers who are typically priced out of areas where they have to work. The specific need to access a workplace seems to be the major shift. How does that open new opportunities for rejigging housing access? No, I totally agree with your point, Camilla. And one of the things that we Dolphin Living have been saying for key workers is we need to look at those who can and can't work from home, and therefore their need to be near their place of work. I think that's an absolutely fundamental point. But we also need to look at the homes that we're delivering for people, and where people can work from home, what type of home we need to deliver for them. Fiona, do you want to share with us anything about how your housing design and development is adapting to sort of the post-COVID world and the working from home that we now find ourselves in?
Yeah, and it's one of the horrible legacies of all of this. It's a very unfair and inequitable situation that the homes I build for sale, I can very easily fit in study space, playroom space, home education space. But the problem with the social housing that I build is allocations policies are about you are given enough space that we as the state have deemed you require. So if you do have to work from home or home educate, well, hopefully you've got space for a kitchen table, and that's your lot, really. The other side of it is, and I think Indy mentioned it, is access to space. There is, as well as an Englishman's home being his castle, there's also an obsession with having a garden. And I do think we have to get a lot better, and we're certainly trying this at L&Q, to get better at those shared open spaces, play spaces that are accessible to all, whether you've bought your home or whether you rent your home. Everybody has access to that amenity space. And I would just throw in something to finish with there. We have to remember that an English person's home has only been their owned castle since 1919, so what's that, 101 years? And in the grand scale of English history, I don't think that's a very long time, but we've suddenly turned ourselves into this idea of owning the asset. And then the final thing to throw in is, if we want more public money to be taken out of that system in some way, we've got to look at how we capture the value that we have inadvertently created through this system. So if you remember, when the Mayor of London decided that the Bakerloo line extension along the Old Kent Road was a good idea, suddenly, if you owned a piece of land on the Old Kent Road, without doing anything at all, you were quids in. Which meant then if the mayor had to actually buy that piece of land to build the infrastructure that was going to make you wealthy, you were sitting on a pot of gold, frankly. So we've got to get our heads around this. I'm not sure Indy's quite got the answer, but at least he's challenging us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Caitlin, have you seen a change in what renters are asking for in response to the pandemic in terms of the design of their home? You know, is what you hear from renters that their home is no longer meeting their needs?
Yeah, absolutely, because as Indy said, I think particularly for renters in London, you traditionally before the pandemic would choose somewhere not too horrible, not too far from your work, basically. And now people are finding, I mean, lots of what we had at the beginning with people that were just basically living with strangers and concerned about both the social impacts of that or the health impacts of that on living in massively overcrowded accommodation. And now, I mean, the thing is that we're hearing from renters who want different things, but until there's any sort of concerted effort to either, you know, change the profile of who is renting or bring rents down, there's still a relative lack of choice. I mean, other than central London rents, which have plummeted, which is quite good fun to go through Rightmove and look at all the properties that were obviously Airbnbs now being let for way cheaper than they normally would be. I think at the moment, like, quite a lot of what we're hearing from renters is that, yeah, it's difficult to work from home in a house with multiple other people and where you might be evicted at, well, it's now 6 months notice, but not before, until August, it was 3 months notice. I think what a lot of the people we speak to, they just want the assurance that they'll be able to pay their rent and keep a roof over their head in what is a very uncertain time. And I think, you know, we have to look at, I just think for me, what this crisis has really shown is how badly the sector was working, how 2/3 of renters don't have any savings because it was seen as completely normal to spend 40-50% of your rent of your income on rent and to put it to a landlord. And I think, lots of housing organisations' focus has been on the immediate issues, like how to make sure that no one gets evicted, how to make sure that no one loses their home. But I think long term, it would be really good if I really hope that the pandemic sparks a conversation about, actually, what do we need from our housing? Is it a well-functioning economy to have 2 million people in London and 13 million people nationally paying over 30% of their income to another individual who they themselves might be indebted to a bank, and really think about how these things are structured. But I think for now, most of what we hear about from renters is just the immediate fear of, will they be able to stay in their houses for the next few months? And also, like, will they not kill their housemates if they're walking to their Zoom calls? I mean, I'm doing mine from my living room and I've banished people to the other room, but so those are different issues.
I think getting on with the people that we live with is something we've all endured, loved in part because you get to spend extra time with your family, but I think particularly for those without the best housing, or where their housing doesn't meet their housing need, that has been particularly stressful. And we've got a question here from Brendan. Where is the innovation in regulation, and how can public entrepreneurship play a part? I wonder, Indy, if this might be something that you want to start with, and then Fiona, I think possibly over to you on that one.
I think there's lots of stuff now being talked about. I don't think we've yet seen it, because I think we're still in the middle of the crisis in a way. I think what we are going to see, and we're seeing many places across Europe talk about the kind of deep retrofit of our homes. I think that will give us a strategic, once in a generational opportunity to invest in, to not only invest in the transformation of our homes, and that's not just energy, it's also kind of water, as well as to do with natural assets and various other things, but also the spatial standards that we want to provide. So there's an opportunity to do that. I think that's going to be critical, because it's going to be vital to rebuild our economy. I think by the time we're at the end of this, we'll be looking to do a deep rebuild, and that's the quickest pathway to jobs. Will not be new homes, but the deep retrofit of homes. And I think that's one of the things that I would say is going to be a really critical role. And it's not just homes, like I said, the street. So that's one aspect. The other thing I think we're seeing lots of is, so we did the work around the High Line in New York, where we looked at the role of smart covenants, which linked the value of how the High Line inflated land value, and how you could link the uplift. So if you took the High Line and you just took 10% of the land value uplift attributable to the High Line, you would have paid for the High Line in 10 months. So what we are looking at is new forms of smart covenants, which link social infrastructure provision back to housing land value uplifts and what they link like. And these could be in perpetuity agreements. Boston Parks Trust has got 1.2 billion at the center of it, and has become an engine for building parks in Boston on the basis of building these new forms of value sharing agreements with private property and civic amenities. So what does that look like? So I think we're going to see lots more innovation in that landscape. And I think the third dimension I would say is that there is the macroeconomic stuff. I just cannot believe that the macroeconomic thesis. I think London, I would say the UK will be having to re-gear ourselves from a property owning or property vested economy to effectively a productivity vested economy. And that's, I think, an intergenerational shift that we're about to face, probably not in a car crash manner, I would say. So I think we're more likely to face it as a result of a major economic crisis and a car crash that we're about to go into than effectively a designed transition scenario. But that would be where I think we'll go.
Okay, thank you. Actually, Fiona, I think there's a better question here for you, which has just been posted by Richard. As we reinvent our working world and the need for commercial space and our high streets shrink, how do we ensure that there is an ability to create quality homes in those buildings or in replacement of those buildings? So how do we use all this space that's being freed up on the high street, and how do we ensure it's for homes, and how do we ensure it's delivered with quality?
Well, we certainly don't use permitted development the way it's been used in the past. That's right. Meow. We have seen some dreadful assaults on our old high streets where you think you can just take over a shop unit and turn it into a home, or take over I've seen some dreadful things on industrial sites. So there are lots of ways we can do this. I think there are some real positives to the planning system in terms of the quality of design. But one of the ideas that we're working hard on at L&Q is about offsite manufacture. And for me, me, that's a way to build inequality into a manufactured process, and stop trying to build each home or each block as if it was something brand new. You know, we know what the size of a bathroom is in a one-bedroom flat generally. Let's get on with it. Let's pod these. Let's manufacture as much as we can. And for me, that is also about a few policy agendas within government being joined together for a change. We need housing in Britain. You know, where it is we can argue about. We need housing. We also need to do something about the manufacturing industry that's dwindling in places like the Midlands, for example. If we lose the car industry in Britain post-Brexit, there's a whole manufacturing base there. Manufacturing cars, manufacturing homes, we can make that shift. And then finally, I spend a lot of time desperately trying to encourage people into the construction industry. And it is still seen as grubby, dirty, something you do out in the cold and the mud. And what offsite manufacture enables us to do is, even at the entry level, it allows us to have more women or people with caring responsibilities working in a 24-hour shift pattern factory at a pace and in a shift pattern that suits their caring responsibilities. So it introduces far more diversity into the workforce. So the government could join those three agendas together very, very easily through the industrial strategy and housing strategy finally talking to each other.
Thank you, Fiona. That's really useful. And we've got one final question that I think we've just about got time for. How do we, and this is from Lawrence Mohammed, how do we save the exodus of talent from London, which is already happening? Conversion of retail to mixed use and or quality housing. I think that's, if I will just take the first point in that, I think it's not just about the housing. I think it's about selling the benefits that London brings, and whether that's in the centre or whether it's in the city villages that Indy talks about, there are agglomeration benefits which a lot of us will have experienced in our careers, about being around other people who are doing similar roles and from whom we can learn for. And, you know, it's that agglomeration of people. It's also the diversity of the different sectors so that people can get a broad experience. So I think that's not just a housing answer, but yeah, and I think the point about conversion of retail is not converting it under permitted development, but creating these centres, whether they be in central London or around in the suburbs, that provide this mix of housing for the sort of the new way of living, so that when you work from home, you know, there are the amenities that we all currently benefit from in the centre of London, whether that's the coffee shops, the restaurants, the parks, the open spaces, that we can benefit from those wherever we live in London. Is there anyone else in the panel that would like to add to that? Otherwise, I'm going to ask you all to maybe just give me one final
Olivia, I'd love to just to say, I think that last question is really important, in a sense that I think London, and this is the centre of London conversation, I think we need to recognise that our thesis and our idea of London is very 2000. We do not have a future view on London. London still feels like it's trying to preserve the past. I think we need a radical vision for what London will be like and what lives and lifestyles and capabilities we need to support. I do not think London is a situation which is currently supporting people to be the best of themselves. The reason why talent is leaving, because it isn't got the fundamental living infrastructure. And I don't mean that just in terms of, I mean that in every level, quality of life. I mean that in childcare. I mean that in housing stock. I mean that in physical environment. I mean actually the kind of deep environmental quality that's going to be required for London to compete. And I think we need a much more deeper renewal of London with a great vision to renew London for the 21st century society and economy. And I don't think we've got that yet. And I don't think this is a tinkering fix. I think this is a very strategic reorganization of London, which requires deep intentionality and focus to embrace that issue. So just to put that there.
Thank you. And Caitlin, one minute, one final ask from you.
I think my final ask is actually, I'm going to repeat a question that went in the chat, which is just what can we achieve with our time and money if it's not going into paying too much for our housing? And I actually think the idea of a London where 2.2 million people didn't spend 40% of their income, or I think it's in some boroughs it's 50% of their income on housing to a private landlord is actually in some ways a really exciting prospect. You'd have more time to do creative things, to have fun, to see your family, like to try new things, to take risks, and that could be a really good thing. So I haven't really answered that, but I thought it was a good question, and I just wanted to draw attention to it as the end of my closing remark.
Thank you, Fiona. Anything from you? Closing remark?
Yeah, just a quick one, and it's almost in response to that question, to what Caitlin has said. Hyde Housing Group, another housing association, calculated that their 36,000 affordable homes put £607 million per year into the British economy. So if people have got more spare cash to spend, they will do something with it, and that's essential. And then my final point is, we've a really unequal system in Britain. Let's make sure that the pandemic means that we move to a fairer system, however that is, and let's make that the legacy of this pandemic.
Thank you so much. We've also done some research at Dolphin Living, which is on our website, which shows that the value of each intermediate home that's provided is significantly greater than the earnings of the individual that live in it. And I think rebalancing towards those that contribute to society rather than just high earners is something that we all need to think about. I'd really like to first of all thank Centre for London for inviting us to join this panel. It's been a really engaging discussion. We've had some really different viewpoints, so thank you everybody. And I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists for an engaging discussion, and I'll hand back to Kate. Thank you very much, Kate.
Hello, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk, so much to think about. Thank you all for being here with us this evening, and thank you also to the sponsors of London Conference 2020. Major sponsors include Corporation of the City of London, L&Q and Uber. Supporting sponsors, London Councils, London Legacy Development Corporation, London Property Alliance, the Greater London Authority, Primera and Trust for London, and exhibitors, Commonplace and the Port of London Authority. We've talked a lot this evening about building a vision for London, and we'd like to mention that we are working on that right now with our London Futures project, looking at London's far future into 2050 and beyond. So you can find that on the centreforlondon.org website. We are skipping the networking session after this so that we can prepare for our first ever London Conference quiz at 7 p.m. tonight, which should be really fun. It's hosted by Tony Travers and Robert Gordon Clark. So if you've been kicking around in London policy for a while, you definitely know those names. And we have Deneen Rowe, Centre for London's own quiz virtuoso. So that should be great. And tomorrow is the final day of London Conference. Our first session starts at 9:30 and is looking at how we can build a renaissance in the cultural sector in London in the 2020s, hosted by Ben Rogers. We'll have around midday, 12:30, a special section on the Black experience of London during 2020. And we'll be finishing up with our audience favorite quickfire ideas round, which is only the ideas of young Londoners this year. So it should be fabulous. Thank you so much, everybody, and we will see you soon. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.